It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us. I'm Devin Whiting, and it's Election Day in South Korea. Millions of people heading to the polls today, and Arirang News has all the latest. There's less than an hour left until the polls close in South Korea's 21st general election. Special quarantine measures have been taken at the polling stations, of course, because of COVID-19, and the authorities are making sure that even people in quarantine can vote. For more on the process, we have our Kan Hyung-woo standing by at a polling station in central Seoul. Hyung-woo, fill us in.
Hi, Devin. South Koreans began casting their ballots at 6 a.m. this morning. And yes, the polling stations will close at 6 p.m., which is about an hour from now. And it's for those people who are not in self-quarantine. Because there are still new cases of the coronavirus here and there in the nation, the National Election Commission has taken a number of preventive measures. Now, voters must bring their ID cards, of course, but they also have to wear a protective face mask when they go in. At the entrance, they get their temperatures taken. If they don't have a fever or a cough, they have to disinfect their hands with hand sanitizer and put on disposable plastic gloves, both of which are provided by the polling station they visit. Voters are also required to stand at least 1 meter apart from each other at all times. I asked some of the voters how they feel about voting in these conditions.
It's my first time voting like this, but I feel clean and I think a lot of people like it this way. I hope they continue to do it this way.
I think it's a good idea to carry out the election. It looks like everything is going well as people are wearing masks, gloves, and keeping distance from each other.
Anyone showing respiratory symptoms or a temperature higher than 37.5 degrees Celsius will be escorted to a separate area to vote.
Now, Hyung-woo, what about those in self-quarantine? The National Election Commission has made it possible for them to cast their ballots too. So how's that going to work?
That's right, Devin. The election authorities are allowing people in self-quarantine to cast their ballots. There are almost 60,000 eligible voters in self-isolation. According to the Ministry of the Interior and Safety, around 23% of them, which is equal to about 13,000 people, have applied to take part in this year's election. Now, these are the rules. The quarantine will be temporarily lifted from 5:20 to 7 p.m. Only then can those in self-quarantine head straight to polling stations on foot or in their own cars. The voting period is from 6 to 7 p.m. after the other voters are finished. Most of those under quarantine will be accompanied by government officials, but those who aren't will be tracked through a mobile app. And of course, they must wear face masks as well. Given that the self-quarantine voters will begin their voting after 6 p.m., the exit poll will be released at 6:15 p.m. That's all I have at this hour. Back to you, Devin.
All right, Kan Hyung-woo, thank you for that. And now we head over to the National Election Commission. Our Lee Kyung-eun is standing by there to tell us more about the voting process and the voter turnout so far. Kyung-eun, what's the latest?
Hi, Devin. So we're inching closer to the final voter turnout, and the National Election Commission here has been keeping track of those numbers on a real-time basis. And as of 4 p.m., the figure is at 59.7%, and that's about 9.5 percentage points higher than at the same time from the previous election. That's also well above the final turnout of that election. It's mainly attributed to the early voter turnout, which has been included as of 1 p.m. Despite concerns due to coronavirus outbreak, this year's early voter turnout has hit a record high of 26.7%. Right now, Jeollanam-do province has the highest turnout with over 63.2%. It has also the highest participation for early voting last weekend. But much attention is also on the southeastern city of Daegu, the city hardest hit by the COVID-19 outbreak in South Korea. Traditionally, Daegu's turnouts were among the country's lowest, but this year the city is seeing some unprecedented developments, including clinching top spot briefly this morning. It seems like COVID-19 has drawn people closer to politics, not away from it. Now the polling stations will close at 6 p.m., but the official final turnout will not be announced until very late at night. In all 5 previous general elections, only once in 2004 has the country seen a turnout at over 60%. But based on the current trend, this year's final turnout could easily surpass that milestone. Devin?
All right, Lee Kyung-eun, thank you for that. Now, this is South Korea's first general election in which 18-year-olds can vote. At the end of last year, South Korea's National Assembly passed an electoral reform bill that lowered the voting age from 19. Now, 18-year-olds are just a tiny percentage of the electorate, but it's a remarkable change because most of them are still in high school. Kim Da-mi reports.
Giving youngsters a voice in the democratic process. 18-year-olds are casting ballots for the first time in South Korean history. Those born on April 16, 2002 or earlier can vote in the April 15 general elections. 18-year-olds account for just over 1% of all voters. The absolute number is not that big, but they may emerge as a new variable as it's the first time that high school students here will be able to vote.
I'm concerned and nervous that I have to make a wise decision. But as a voter, I feel I'm officially a part of our community. For young voters as a whole, it's a great opportunity to select the representatives who will work for our communities.
Young voters' political participation is also expected to bring extra youthfulness to local politics and boost younger generations' political clout in their communities.
By reflecting younger generations' political ideals, we can secure justice between generations in this aging society with such a low birth rate. Young voters can and should strengthen their judgment skills and abilities through discussions including diverse perspectives.
To prevent the politicization of classrooms and to better guide young voters, the National Election Committee initially planned to visit and educate all high school voters ahead of the election. However, with the COVID-19 crisis postponing the spring semester, local governments and schools turned to more accessible, approachable ways to teach young voters.
We try to make the learning process as simple as possible. Our videos have Q&As on proper election campaigning, things voters should keep in mind, and a detailed outline of the voting process at polling stations.
To encourage teenage voters to participate in democracy in the midst of this pandemic, South Korea's Education Ministry also plans to share election materials on the National Election Committee website. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
The International Monetary Fund has warned that the global economy is on track for its sharpest downturn in nearly a century. Global growth this year will be negative because of what the IMF is calling the Great Lockdown. Kim Yo-sun reports.
The global economy is expected to shrink 3% this year as the international community fights the COVID-19 pandemic. That's according to the IMF, which explained Tuesday that this will be the steepest downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s.
So now, under the assumption that the pandemic and required containment peaks in the second quarter in most countries in the world and then recedes in the second half of this year, we are projecting global growth in 2020 to fall to minus 3%. This makes the Great Lockdown the worst recession since the Great Depression and far worse than the global financial crises.
The IMF explained this is a significant drop of 6.3 percentage points from its previous forecast in January. It also slashed South Korea's economic outlook for this year to minus 1.2% after an initial prediction of 2% growth last October. However, it expects a so-called V-shaped recovery for South Korea and the global economy next year, forecasting 3.4% and 5.8% growth for South Korea and the world, respectively. At the same time, it acknowledged that prospects for 2021 remain clouded by uncertainty. Describing the situation as, quote, the Great Lockdown, the IMF added that both developed and developing countries will face economic difficulties.
So for the first time since the Great Depression, both advanced economies and emerging and developing economies are in recession. For 2020, growth in advanced economies is projected at minus 6%. Emerging market and developing economies, which typically have normal growth levels well above advanced economies, are also projected to have negative growth of minus 1% and minus 2.2% if you exclude China.
The IMF highlighted that the international community needs to carry out monetary, fiscal, and financial policies together with the aim of cushioning the impact of the COVID-19 shock, as well as to ensure a sustainable recovery once the pandemic is under control. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
South Korea reported 27 more cases of COVID-19 on Wednesday. The third day in a row, there have been fewer than 30. The number's been under 50 now for a seventh straight day. Total infections in South Korea now stand at 10,591. Of the new cases reported Wednesday, 11 were imported, with 4 detected at quarantine checkpoints. The country reported 3 more deaths, raising the death toll to 225. The total number of people who've recovered is now 7,616, with the country's recovery rate at nearly 72%. Around the world, the total number of coronavirus cases is nearing 2 million. While the pandemic surges in the U.S., Britain, and France, some other countries seem to be getting back on track. Oh Soo-young reports.
Nearly 2 million people worldwide have been infected with COVID-19. Data from Johns Hopkins University as of Tuesday U.S. time shows over 1.9 million people have been diagnosed with the virus, and the death toll has surpassed 119,000. The US has at least 594,000 cases and some 25,000 deaths. The state of New York alone has more infections than any country in the world, with over 106,000 patients. The situation in Europe is mixed. The first countries to bear the brunt of the virus, Italy, Spain and Austria, are allowing some non-essential workers to go back to work, as they have seen their new infection cases fall. On Tuesday, Italy saw fewer than 3,000 new cases for the first time in a month. But the pandemic has worsened in the UK, where as of Tuesday evening local time, the death toll increased by 778, topping 12,000. France also saw a similar number of daily deaths and became the fourth country after the US, Spain and Italy to record more than 15,000 fatalities. Britain and France are expected to keep their lockdowns in place until next month. In India, the country's Prime Minister Narendra Modi extended the world's largest lockdown of 1.3 billion people until May 3rd, as cases continue to grow. Meanwhile, Russia on Tuesday recorded over 2,700 new infections, bringing the total case count there to more than 21,000. In Japan, COVID-19 cases rose by 482 on Tuesday, and the number of deaths rose by 19, the country's highest daily death increase so far. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
U.S. President Donald Trump says Washington will stop funding the World Health Organization while it reviews the agency's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In his coronavirus press briefing on Tuesday, President Trump said the WHO failed in its basic duty and must be held accountable. He accused it of mismanaging and covering up the spread of the coronavirus and putting political correctness above saving lives. He was referring to the WHO relaying China's early assurances about the virus and opposing the initial travel restrictions on China. The U.S. has been giving the WHO up to $500 million a year. And the United States has thanked South Korea for shipping the country hundreds of thousands of COVID-19 test kits. The State Department said Tuesday that it appreciated the role of the South Korean government in making the purchase possible and its help in America's fight against the pandemic. On the same day, U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper also expressed thanks. Some 600,000 test kits were procured by the U.S. through 2 South Korean companies and another 150,000 from a third South Korean firm. The test kits were given interim approval by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and they're due to arrive there by Wednesday local time. That brings us to the end of this newscast. More Election Day updates coming up at 7 p.m. Korea time when the polls will have closed. Thank you for watching.